Booked for Murder, Chapter 3, Through the Wardrobe. Ivy held a warm plastic container lined with foil and full of cinnamon rolls while she watched Agnes zip up her coat and pull on a knit scarf and hat. "I'm glad you have a down jacket. I need to knit you a scarf," Agnes winked. "At least the lightning has stopped." She opened the side door and Ivy followed her out into the morning. After locking the door, Agnes took the rolls. "Black is your color. We'll have to find a complementary color for your scarf." A gust of cold wind tangled the mane of hair that escaped Ivy's beanie. She jammed her hands deep into her coat pockets. It was 43 degrees out, according to her weather app, but the wind and moisture in the air made it feel more like 10 below. Ivy walked beside Agnes, who described all the people living in their brightly colored 100-year-old homes, mixed with small beachy-looking cabins on her street. While pointing to a 2-story shingled salt box with red trim, Agnes said, "Jack's family has lived in that house for almost 100 years. My son played with his older boy, Jack Jr. They own the hardware store in town. Wonderful people." A few more blocks down, the road leveled out, and they crossed the Balefire Market's parking lot and followed the sidewalk around a large brick building. The sign on the door said, "Balefire Police Department." Good grief. I'm surrounded. There weren't any police when I needed them. Now I want to avoid them. They're everywhere. One more block and around the corner was Balefire Bay. She stopped and tried to take it all in. The Pacific Ocean, dark, green, blue, and churning, stretched to the edge of the world, where it looked like it just fell off. Gray clouds were rolling in low over the sea. The swells were still immense, angry and white-capped, making her cringe at the thought of Agnes's son in his small boat. Saltbox-style shops with vintage seaside flavor faced the bay. A highway separated the shops from a wide sidewalk that ran around the bay, bordered by a low stone wall built to protect walkers from falling off the cliff into the sea. They crossed the street and walked to the wall. She put her hands on the cold, wet stones and looked over the rock wall. 40 feet below, waves broke against the cliff, hard enough to send spray over the wall and onto Ivy's hunter boots. The vast sea made her feel smaller than usual. A white lighthouse standing alone, high on the north head, looked like it rose out of the sea just to tower over the town. An ornate black wrought iron fence surrounded the deep green lawn encircling the lighthouse. Rugged cliff walls rose to meet the green grass. Longer grass waved in the wind between the fence and a straight drop of hundreds of feet to jagged rocks and wild tides. "Is that the cliff the woman you were talking about fell from?" Ivy asked. Smiling sadly, Agnes nodded. "It's around 1,200 feet high." "How awful. No one could survive a fall from that height." The peninsula had rugged beauty. A rolling field east and below the lighthouse disappeared into a forest of pine trees, where a smattering of houses was tucked into evergreens along the cliff's edge. The largest house sat closest to the lighthouse. It fascinated her. From where she stood, the mixture of large stones and wood made it blend in with its environment, more like it had grown there, but looked new. It practically hung off the side of the cliff. "I'd better relieve Jenny, so she can get the kids to school on time." "Take all the time you want," Agnes said, her bright eyes twinkling as she patted Ivy's shoulder. "I'm ready for one of your cinnamon rolls," Ivy said. She followed Agnes to the crosswalk. The town was quiet in the early morning hours. Only a few cars were parked on the street in front of the Balefire Bay book and tea shop. Agnes took her rolls into the shop. Ivy stood outside long enough to enjoy the quaint, small-paned windows and window boxes on either side of the double wooden doors. The window on the right had the words "Tea and Coffee" painted in white across the top. The window on the left said "Bookshop." A kitschy carved wooden sign over the vintage-looking double doors said "Balefire Bay, Book and Tea." Both windows had displays that reminded Ivy that Valentine's Day had just passed. It took her away from the bay for a moment and back to the previous holiday. It had been like any other day of that year. It was full of broken promises, punctuated by abuse and mind games. She had only one face for everyone and everything outside the doors of their tidy house. It masked her dark, dangerous, and weighty feelings behind the insincere smiles and shallow conversations. Valentine's Day had become another opportunity to appear happy on demand. The window on the right had a display for the tea shop. A red willow tea set sat on a pink cloth. Sugar cookies, decorated with red, white, and pink frosting, were arranged on a plate and scattered around the cloth. The bookstore window on the left had the same pink cloth with scattered confetti hearts and wooden easels holding books. She loved the 2 leather-bound classic books in the display, Romeo and Juliet and Jane Austen's Emma. New books she was dying to read stood on the 3 other stands, including And Then She Left, by a New York Times best-selling author. A perfect read for my disappearance, Ivy thought. Beyond the windows, an enticing fire was burning in a fireplace surrounded by a circle of overstuffed chairs, already filled with people she guessed were Agnes's book club. Behind the gathering, shelves were full of books. The books made Ivy drool like a gambling addict, buying a lotto ticket. She closed her eyes and fell into her obsessive craving for the shelves of beloved books she'd left behind. Muffled talk and a delightful ripple of laughter brought her back to the present. Ivy guessed the woman with salt and pepper hair, knitting by the fire, must be the partner Agnes told her about on the bus. Anne was partially hidden by a newspaper and sitting in a chair closest to the fire. A beautiful blonde with hot pink lips and a lot of product in her perfectly coiffed hair was leaning towards him, talking and laughing, touching his arm, and letting her tea get cold. All she could see of the person near the window was the back of their chair and head. Is this really a book club? She wondered. When she opened the door, a blast of warm air and the scent of cinnamon rolls enveloped her. A woman wearing a green sage boho bandana that matched her eyes and held back wild brown curls held the door open for Ivy. Ivy supposed she was Jenny, the person Agnes was relieving so she could go home and get her kids off to school. Jenny buttoned the front of her Irish wool sweater, looked over her shoulder. Bye, Aggie. Then she blew a kiss to the woman who was knitting. When she smiled, she revealed deep dimples surrounded by freckles. See you at lunchtime, Mom. Excuse me, she said when she passed Ivy and left. The older woman, sitting by the fire, looked up from her knitting and called to Jenny, Tell Jessie and Emily I'll take them to the pool at the rec center this afternoon. They'd love that. Thanks, Mom, Jenny said. She waved at her mother and smiled brightly as she slipped past Ivy. Agnes was on the tea side of the large open room, arranging cookies and baked goods in a glass case, sitting on the marble counter of a carved white island. The cinnamon rolls were already in a warming oven next to the espresso machine on the counter behind her. What would you like, tea or coffee? Agnes asked. Ivy studied the chalkboard menu on the wall. May I have a chai tea with cream? Ivy asked. I have my own special blend of chai. Would you like sugar? Do you have any oat creamer? Ivy asked. This is Oregon. I have almond, coconut, and oat milk, all organic. She chuckled. Let me introduce you to our little breakfast bunch. I texted the group last night and told them all about you. I'll make your chai and bring it to you. Agnes walked toward the gathering and then looked back to make sure Ivy was following her. Ivy's chest tightened. She reminded herself to breathe. She looked over the group, who knew everything Agnes knew. What a lot of half-truths to keep track of, she thought. A middle-aged, overweight officer wearing a relaxed uniform sat in a chair with his back to the window. The officer had a thick 70s mustache and leaned back holding a coffee in a to-go cup and studying her from behind aviator glasses. This is Chief Anderson, Agnes said. The double doors opened, and Connor came in with wet hair and a uniform like the chief's. His mouth turned up at the corners with an irritatingly amused smile. He gave her a single nod, kissed Agnes's cheek, and sat in the chair by the chief, looking into her eyes long enough to make her uncomfortable. She had to look the other way. He was enormously handsome in daylight. This is our Jenny's mother, Jessica, a fellow knitter, my dearest friend, and owner of Balefire Books. Your bookstore is beautiful, Ivy said. Jessica stopped knitting. Thank you. Welcome to Balefire. She smiled brightly at Ivy. Her watery blue eyes twinkled. Agnes tilted her head toward the blonde. Veronica Smith is a town council member and volunteer extraordinaire. Her best friend, Deb, is the wonderful baker I told you about. Veronica leaned forward and held her manicured hand out for Ivy to shake. Noisy silver bracelets jangled on her thin arms during the dainty exchange. She reminded Ivy of a close friend she'd once thought was a mean girl until she got to know her well. She struggled to withhold her judgment of Veronica. "Everyone, this is Ivy Kelly. We hit it off yesterday on our ride back to the coast." Ivy looked from face to face. "Too many cops. I need to leave as soon as I can." Veronica's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I don't know, Agnes. Xander's library is full of valuable books. The rare books collection would be a difficult challenge for any of us, I'm sure. This girl doesn't want to tackle that." She patted the knee of the man behind the paper. He put down the newspaper, and Ivy's heart stopped. 1,000 thoughts sped through her brain. She knew who he was. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone who loves books, mysteries, romance, and intrigue. There, right in front of her, sat Alexander Knightley. Look at him. He's totally at home. He let Agnes call him Xander. Does he like it? His hair is so thick. What's with the flannel shirts in Oregon? He smiled and looked like he should be on the cover of the Rolling Stone magazine or a sweet, cozy, clean book. "It's nice to meet you, Ivy. How do you like our small town?" Smile lines creased the corner of his famous golden green eyes. He was only 32 when he finished his first novel, and it shot to #1 on every bookseller's list, including the New York Times. The last 7 years had only made the sun-tanned, muscular man and his thick hair look better and better. She thought he must be wearing contacts or had LASIK eye surgery. Early in his career, a journalist revealed he couldn't read without a pair of thick Harry Potter glasses. A photograph of him in the round black glasses made the tabloids. He had owned his Harry Potter fan status and put the photo in the tabloids on the back of his earlier books. She liked his new brand. "Get it together, fangirl." She chastised herself and took a deep breath and managed to say, I love your book. It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Knightley." "Thank you," Xander said. He had a slight hint of an Australian accent. Ivy knew it was from spending a few years as a child in Australia before his divorced mother moved him back to the States. She knew everything about him. Well, at least what the media knew. Veronica leaned forward in her chair and put a hand on his arm, protecting her territory. "Balefire Bay protects Xander's privacy. We all keep Xander off our social media feeds and out of the local news." Ivy's brows knit together and she stepped back. "Of course, I understand. It must be hard to be recognized everywhere you go. Does Veronica assume I'm an author-stalking psycho? Okay, maybe I am. She has no right, though, to judge me like I'm judging her." Xander stood up. "Don't take Veronica too seriously. She's protective, but she's there for her friends, no matter who they are. Aggie told me you're qualified to help me in my new library and rare books." Thoughts sped through Ivy's mind. Alexander Knightley changed everything. "I have a new name. He doesn't want anyone to know he's here. It's a small town on the other side of the continent." She remembered Darlene's warnings and shut them down, shook them off, and took an intentional risk. After all, she said to herself, this is Alexander Fantastic Knightley. "I would love to hear more about your project," Ivy said. "Let's steal some of Aggie's cinnamon rolls. We can talk in the tea room." He winked at Agnes and motioned for Ivy to follow him. He took 2 rolls out of the warming oven and placed them on plates, like he lived in the store. "Let me make you chai and coffee," Agnes said. She quietly went to work. Xander and Ivy sat at a table. You're Alexander Knightley." Can I say anything more embarrassing? Of course he knows who he is. "Yes, but please call me Xander." He looked amused. "Relax. In Balefire, I'm not Alexander Knightley. I'm Xander. It's one of the reasons I built my new home here. I get to be a local and treated the same as everyone else. Take Veronica. She's just as rude to me as she is to everyone she likes." He wiggled his eyebrows, and Ivy stifled laughter. Stop. I don't have anything. Don't bring up the past." She searched for a way to finish her sentence without giving anything away. She'd been to a dozen of his book signings and owned everything he had ever written. Well, she used to own his books. She started again. "I've read all of your books." "Thank you. What did you think of them?" "I love a good mystery. I solved them all before the final reveal." His mouth fell open, his brows rose, and he laughed loudly. "No one has ever said that to me before." What is wrong with me? Ivy put her hands over her mouth and under her wide eyes. I mean, they were hard to solve. Before she could think of anything else to say, Agnes brought their tea and coffee to the table and patted Ivy's shoulder. The roll smelled so good. Her stomach growled loudly. Xander pressed his lips together, but his laughing eyes gave him away. She quickly picked up the sticky roll and took a huge bite to keep herself from saying anything else. She wanted to close her eyes in foodie ecstasy, but she delicately dabbed her lips with her napkin. So, you don't like my books? He tilted his head and suppressed a chuckle. She held one finger in the air and gestured to her full mouth. He shook his head, sitting up, and after a deep breath, looked serious enough to make her wish she didn't have a mouthful of food. I've had a headhunter at a staffing agency searching for the right person to help me with my library and collection. I've asked every friend and professional I know and interviewed several candidates. But each person I contacted loses interest the second they learn they need to live in Balefire, in the middle of nowhere, and work when I have the time to work with them. She tipped her head, still chewing furiously, unable to comprehend that anyone wouldn't want to work with a genius like Knightley. As an author, I write when I need to, but I write best when I'm inspired. When I'm in the zone, I realize hours have passed without my noticing them. If we're scheduled to work and I forget or cancel, so I can continue to write or sleep after an all-nighter, will that be a problem for you? Ivy shook her head. Not at all. I'm a research librarian for a law school, or I was. On occasions, I was up all night looking for just the right case law. Some of the world's best books were written by candlelight. Does your work also require you to travel to book signings and events? He chuckled. Actually, that's one of the interesting outcomes of COVID. Before, I needed to live in New York and be ready to travel to signings. Now, most of my meetings, events, and interviews are virtual. My agent is pushing me to build my platform and brand. I'm not even sure what my brand is. The upside of virtual events is that it allows me to live in Balefire Bay, 3 hours away from the airport. COVID changed everything, didn't it? I feel like I'll forever use two phrases to talk about my life. Before COVID and after COVID, Ivy said. Exactly. Anyway, as a result, I purchased the decommissioned lighthouse and began building my dream home midway through 2020. I lost some priceless friends and authors. I realized I need to live now and stop putting off doing the things I'd always dreamed of. Because of my love for books, I've accumulated enough to fill my new library, including rare and valuable volumes I've purchased over the year or inherited from my grandmother. I'd planned to wait until I was older and done writing to build my house, but now I know life's too short to wait, and writers write until we die. He was silent for a moment, looking past her at nothing or someone he must have lost. She waited silently until he came back in the room in time. She understood loss deeply. Then he looked straight into her eyes. How did you get through COVID? I baked a lot, she shrugged, and hooked up with a psychopath. Anderson cooks at the house. I would be asking you to organize the main library in a way that makes sense, is easy to use, and pleasing to the eye. My insurance company has asked for an inventory of my rare books. Once that's done, there's more work on my list. I want to invest and increase my collection. I will also be using the library for online meetings or book interviews. Ivy listened, comfortable with every task he listed, wanting the job more and more. She noticed a loose lock of hair. Xanderlicious, she thought. Do you feel you have the qualifications it takes to do the job? What? Excuse me? The job. Do you feel you're qualified? Yes, absolutely, Ivy said. She knew he wanted more information. Something about his honest and open way of talking to her made her feel she could trust him. After all, she had a new name. Arlene in legal aid helped her get her diploma and other important documents updated in the new name. Why not tell him what I can do? Do you have a degree in library science? Have you worked in a library before? He asked. I have a degree from Harvard in library sciences. I was a faculty research librarian for the Harvard Law Department. His mouth fell open for just a minute, and then he laughed like a little boy who'd just gotten a puppy for Christmas. You're pulling my leg. Aggie put you up to this. No. Aggie didn't put me up to this. It's all true. I have the diploma to prove it. Our little book club is going to love you. She tilted her head. Pardon? Still smiling, he said. We like to keep track of local crime. We met forming a neighborhood watch and went a little overboard. So you're nosy gossips? Now Ivy was smiling, her brows raised, stifling laughter. He laughed loud enough that the group in the chairs stopped talking and were looking their way. He ran his hand through his hair, making it stand up. He locked eyes with her. We talk about books too sometimes. Still grinning, he said, If you're for real, I will have to believe in miracles. My coming to Balefire isn't a miracle. Agnes talked me into it, and talked, and talked. He laughed again. The group around the fireplace sounded like an argument was starting, and then laughed together. Xander, we need you, Veronica said, dragging out the word need. Seriously, the chief turned and motioned with his toothpick for Xander to rejoin the conversation. Xander looked at the chief and then back at her. I'm not doing a very good job of interviewing you, but since the chief almost never asks for help, I better go back. We need to finish our conversation, though. Do you mind joining us? Then you and I can talk when they all leave for work. Ivy's mind wrestled as she followed him back to the fire. He won't hire me. He must think I'm a psycho fangirl. Did he say what it paid? Do I want this job? I've said too much. He'll Facebook stalk me and find out I don't exist. Good gobstoppers, I haven't set up my new email yet. Sitting across from Xander, she watched the banter, trying to be invisible, but right in the middle of the strangest conversation. The chief rolled his toothpick back and forth in his mouth. You really need to build a fence up there. Half your guests are a bunch of drunks. They'll all take a wrong turn and find themselves driving off your cliff. The other half are families who've got dirty, rotten, spoiled kids. Mark my words. Some mother is going to be chasing her stinking kid, and they're going to run themselves right over the edge, like Bonnie did. I've got a fence around the lighthouse. Xander sipped his coffee. That's not the point, Chief, Veronica said. The point is, you don't know if it was an accident or murder. Now that we know who she is, we need to know if she fell or was pushed. And if so, who had a motive to push her off a cliff? Right, Xander? Xander nodded in agreement. If we don't take care of it quickly and quietly, we'll have the press all over the sanctuary, looking for someone to blame. The buck stops with me. Xander shrugged and sat back in his chair. Yes, Chief, Veronica said, for Xander's sake. We need to make sure there wasn't a murder. Let us help you find out what happened at the reunion. I agree, Connor said quietly, holding his hot tea with both hands. He looked at the chief expressionless. I was working the reunion and on patrol that night. I keep racking my brain trying to remember any small detail I missed. If I'd been paying better attention, maybe Bonnie would still be alive. The chief frowned, pointing with his toothpick to make a point. This is Balefire. I've been a chief of police for 30 years. We're a quiet town. Nothing happens here ever. And if it does, I won't need help handling it. We can take this apart forever, but the outcome is always going to be as boring as Balefire. Bonnie Riley had an accident or suicide. Ivy's mind was reeling. Her inner researcher kicked into high gear. It began organizing all the pieces of her conversation with Agnes about a young woman falling off the cliff, and adding in the fact that Alexander, the man she idolized and wanted to work for, might be responsible for the death of a woman named Bonnie. Did they know her? Was she a tourist? What kind of reunion? Ivy asked. She put her hand over her mouth. Stand down. This is not my problem. I can't afford to go full researcher on them. The chief kept picking his teeth. Ivy wanted to shake him. Connor turned to face her. Bonnie Riley was here for a class reunion when she fell off the cliff by North Cape Lighthouse. The one by Xander's house? Ivy asked. Xander's brows drew together. It had nothing to do with anything local. The chief is sure it's an accident. Tourists are always climbing fences, no matter how high, to get closer to the edge. One wrong step and... He didn't finish his sentence. Veronica interrupted. That's exactly why we need to put it to rest. Everyone was drinking at the reunion. Any one of us could have wandered off in the dark and fallen over the cliff, Veronica said. I was there with Roger, Jack, and Debbie. You know none of us did it, but surely one of us saw or heard something. Connor looked at Xander. Since the dance was on your property, where were you? Xander leaned toward Connor. She rented one of my cabins. Of course I feel responsible, even though I didn't see or hear anything. I don't know whether it was an accident or suicide. I could put up a big chain-link fence, but if someone wants to get closer or look over the cliffs, they'll climb it, just like she must have climbed the iron fence. Not to be cold, but I'm more worried about reporters showing up and ending my chance to live here in peace and write at Knightley House. Ivy's stomach lurched. He hadn't answered Connor's question. Where was he? She wondered if he cared more about his privacy than Bonnie. The doors opened, and a woman with blonde hair like Veronica's, pale and quiet, joined the group. She glanced sideways at Ivy, but didn't speak. Veronica smiled at the woman. Ivy, this is my best friend, Debbie. We've been together since school. We're so tight, our husbands are jealous. She laughed lightly. The woman looked at Veronica and smiled faintly. Then she looked back down, and Ivy watched her cheeks turn pink with embarrassment. Hi, Debbie. Ivy smiled broadly at her and waited for her to look up. She didn't. It was as if a dark rain cloud had slid into the room. The chief hoisted himself up and adjusted his duty belt. Connor, why don't you and Veronica make us a guest list from the party? We'll question everyone. That includes you too, Veronica. Xander. I have a meeting with Patty this morning. He nodded. Agnes, I don't know what you're putting in your baking tomorrow, but it's going to be hard to top your cinnamon rolls. I'll see you later for lunch. Agnes nodded, smiling. Connor put his hat on and followed the chief out. Veronica leaned over and put her hand on Xander's arm. Would you take me up to the sanctuary and show me where it happened? Maybe we can find a clue. I can't believe anyone would push Sweet Bonnie off a cliff. We must prove it's an accident. Ivy rolled her eyes. She wants to do more than look at the sanctuary. Working with him is less and less magical and more complicated. Thanks, Veronica. I need to interview Ivy and show her around today. I'm sure I'll be down for coffee again this week. Veronica glanced at Ivy before turning and smiling demurely at Xander and touching him again. Another time, then. Jessica stayed in her chair, knitting by the fire. Veronica looked at Agnes, Xander, and Ivy and waved. Come along, Debbie. Toodles. Tell me again, what's the real reason you left Harvard? Relax, it's Alexander Stinking Knightley, and he's not a killer. He doesn't know your ex-husband, and he isn't going to call anyone and tell your ex where you are. He likes his privacy, and I want to disappear. It's a win-win for both of us. She convinced herself. Give him the truth. Here goes. The full story? I am really a Harvard graduate, and I did major in library sciences and minored in law. I was working in the law department as a research librarian and making plans to publish. He leaned back in his chair. He didn't say anything for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a minute while he examined her face. She could imagine Darlene's voice scolding her. But look at him. It's Alexander Knightley, and he needs my help. Surely I can trust him with this part of the truth. Quietly, she admitted, I had a bad breakup. I needed to take a break. The house was his. The car I drove belonged to him. I hated hurting him, but it was time to move on. I lived on the coast with my parents once. I decided if I had to start over, I wanted to be near the ocean. I planned to look for work in Portland. What happened to that idea? He frowned and looked pensively at her. Ivy shrugged. I told you, Agnes. Ha! He said it so loudly she jumped. He chuckled softly. Ivy, remind me to tell you the story of how I came to Balefire someday. Here's the deal. I have as many books as most small public libraries. I've collected so many rare books over the years that I'm not sure what they're worth. The library in my first house was so small I had to rent storage units for the less valuable books, and, before you ask, no, I don't want to sell any of them. I was so poor as a kid I couldn't afford comics, much less a book. I promised myself if I ever had the money, I would have all the books I'd ever read or wanted. And do you? Ivy asked. He chuckled. No, but I have more than I know what to do with. When I built this house, I built the library of my dreams. Her dreams. He was living her dreams. Having a library to read in, maybe even write in? She was speechless. I'd like to officially offer you the position. Will you take the job? He asked. She wrestled with her thoughts for a moment and then did what every woman does in a horror movie. Yes, she said. At the same time, Darlene was in her head, screaming, No, don't go in the library. Don't go in the library. Great, I'm willing to give you a try. I also have a cabin set aside for the position, if you don't mind a tiny house. Hotels and rentals in town are rented out year-round to tourists at prices most locals can't afford. All I need now is for you to do a background check for my insurance company. The local police department will take your fingerprints for a non-criminal Justice National background check. She froze. Fingerprints? Time stood still while thoughts raced through her mind. Don't do this. You know how this ends. Don't. What if someone else gets hurt when he finds me? She exhaled slowly and unzipped her coat. A drop of sweat ran down her back as she crossed her legs, sinking deeper into her chair. What should I do? Run. But look at him. It's Alexander Stinking Knightley, and he wants me. Okay, he wants me to work for him, but still. I am an idiot. The memory of an angry face flashed through her mind. Stop, get out of my head. She tried to smile while she folded her arms. She was sure it looked more like she had sucked on a lemon. I can figure this out. Maybe put off the fingerprints. He'll love my work and forget about them. I've got ID in my new name. What if he's a stone-cold killer who will toss me off a cliff? Don't be silly. Do it. Did that work for you? He leaned forward. She gave him a quick nod. I'm doing this. He exhaled loudly and fell back in his chair. He smiled a beautiful smile. Good. I was ready to give up and see if Veronica would do it. You don't mind if I tell Veronica about your degree, do you? If I ask her, she won't tell anyone else except Debbie. She shrugged and tried to melt deeper in her chair. Now I've done it. Hi, I'm Shannon Symonds. I'm the author of Booked for Murder in the Balefire Bay Cozy Mysteries, and I read aloud when I edit my books, so I thought it would be fun this time just to tape it and let you listen. Chapter 3 is where you get to kind of meet the Balefire Bay and the people that are in the town, and I'm going to tell you that there's a town on the Oregon coast called Depot Bay, and there's another town, Newport. And kind of what I did when I wrote this book is I meshed it all up in my head and made my dream town, just exactly what I wanted. And if I owned a bookstore, it's the bookstore I'd want to own, which is a very cool thing about being an author. You can make your characters thin when you're overeating. You can make a bookstore that you just dream of having when you don't. I really love Ivy. Maybe I love Ivy because of some of my personal experiences. There was a point in my life where I had a bunch of little kids and I came to Oregon and went off the grid for very good reasons. And I'm not alone in that. There are a lot of women that have that experience. And the cool thing is that of the thousands of women, I would say 1,000 to 2,000 women that I've worked with over the years, they're strong. Like, it is the most unusual people that you would expect to get trapped in something as unpleasant as domestic violence. And so I want to tell you that one of the things that I love is writing about strong women. When we looked at the data, only about, I want to say about 11% of the perpetrators repeated and less of the victims. Most of the people that I worked with went on to have happy endings and happy lives. So I guess that's what I wish you tonight. And if you get a chance, you can look on my Instagram because I took some pictures while I was down there. Balefire has a little charter, and for not very much, I took my daughters out and we followed whales around the bay. When I was there this last weekend, we could see them spouting and it was so fun. Like, one's back came up. While we were on the boat for another trip that I took, one of the larger whales like pulled up alongside the ship. And of course I'm out in the front hanging onto the rail so I can see as much as possible. And because I'm crazy. And the whale just kind of rolled on its side and its eye looked at us. And it was incredible. I have a deep love for large things like whales. So fun. Balefire in a storm is amazing. So the pictures that I took, it's a really low tide, but when it's high tide, there are actually some rocks in some of the beaches and in Depot Bay where water will shoot up when the waves hit the cliffs. Water will shoot up in the air. The cliff in this book, where the lighthouse is a mountain that we hike every year, and I've heard 2 different measurements, but I believe it's 1,200 feet high. And I will never forget being a kid. I started with my dad and my uncles because we lived up here when I was a kid, all summers. every vacation. We were here together as a family. And so I was with my uncle and my cousins and my dad, and we're hiking over the head. And I just can't even explain it. The cliffs are just a sheer drop. And this young man, I would guess he was 17 or 18, came climbing over the edge. Not kidding you. He had to have hand climbed that whole cliff. And he started calling, help, help. And I started to go to him. My dad stopped me. And he said, my friend is down the cliff and I need to get help. Can you drive me to Cannon Beach? And my dad looked back at all the girls that he was taking care of and he said no. And I was so mad. It's like, you can't do that to him, Dad. And he said, somebody else will take him that doesn't have all of his girls with him. And so he was being protective, but at the time I was a little freaked out. The young man did go. They did call the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard came and pulled his friend off the side of the mountain. What happens is people start hiking around the head when the tide's low and all the rocks are showing, and they think they can get around before the tide comes back, and they can't. We also this weekend, Saturday, we went out to the Coast Guard Air Base. And I tell you, if you want to meet a true hero, meet a Coast Guard rescue swimmer. Or like my nephew, who's a naval rescue swimmer. They are the gutsiest. They're just amazing. Cape Disappointment's up the road, and I think there's actually a reality show about what they do. They're out almost every day. There's a rescue every day out at sea or on the mountains, and Tillamook Head is prime for people getting stuck. And so they'll come out, hover, they'll drop the Coast Guard person down in a rope, put him in a sling and carry him back up. And if there's injuries, they're prepared to take him to the hospital where Life Flight takes him to the next leg of the trip. So I don't want you to think Oregon is dangerous. It's not if you know what you're doing and you live here. If you don't know what you're doing, you come to visit, email me, shannonsimonsauthor@gmail.com, and ask me, hey, is it a good idea too? And I'll let you know. And also tell you where the secret places are, and I'll talk about it in upcoming chapters. So thanks for listening, and subscribe if you want, and that will give me a chance to get to know you, give you a chance to get to know me, and hopefully in the comments you'll tell me how bad I stink. I am not an actress. I did one play in high school. I played Anne Boleyn. They cut my head off. It was over quick. And that's my kind of acting. And so doing different voices for me is really hard. But I like reading my books out loud, and I like to have audiobooks from my mother. So thanks for listening.